Hello everybody, welcome back to JBS. This time we've been going through a bunch of genres that are found in the Bible, and I've been giving some kind of tips and tricks as to how to read through them and get the most out of them. And this week we're taking a kind of a turn or a shift away from the more common or the more easily understood kind of genres, and we're delving into poetry. And poetry is strange, mainly because we spend so much of our lives taking things literally, and that's great, that's fantastic, that's how we can be so efficient with the way that we communicate, and the life functions really well when we're literal, but poetry is very metaphorical, which can kind of been seen as an opposite to literally. In that poetry often doesn't mean what it is expressly stating. So, for example, when it's, where is it? I think it's in the Psalms where it says that God has not abandoned her, he will strengthen her. We might be thinking, oh yeah, okay, cool. There's this woman that God is supporting and empowering, and that's fantastic, because she clearly has some kind of a trial that she's going through. But the actual kind of context and reality of that situation is that the her or the she in that little chapter is actually relating to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is being sieged and it's being destroyed, and it's not great. And so they've personified Jerusalem as a woman, and God is relating to her in this very poetic, metaphoric way. I suppose that's actually quite literal. The metaphor comes in the personification of Jerusalem, and the relationship that God has with them is then where it starts to become a little bit more literary, and we kind of get the point that there's a struggle coming on Jerusalem, and God is supporting it, has not forgotten Jerusalem or those within it, and it will endure. But nevertheless, there is kind of a line between taking things literally and taking things metaphorically, and I think that we really struggle when it comes to that. All we have to do is look at kind of the book of Revelation, where almost nothing can be taken literally, and it's just an absolute mess, and if you try to read it literally, you're going to confuse yourself and accomplish nothing. And so when we're looking at poetry, we should perhaps take a little bit of a step back and think of it more in terms of themes rather than the specific words that are being chosen. And then we want to be working that backwards, right? So usually when we're looking at a chapter or a passage, we look at what it's saying, and then that will point us towards the theme. Whereas within poetry, we'll read what it's saying and we'll pick up on the theme. It won't be explicitly stated, but the wording and the language will deepen the knowledge of the theme that's being presented there. And I do think that poetry is a genre that is worth discussing, because it pops up all over the place. Like, we can just be going for a little romp through the passages of Samuel's, and then suddenly this woman's going to burst out in kind of a poetic, prophetic song, which is kind of the merging of three different genres. What do we do with that? But it'll pop up all over the place. And when it does, we need to be able to take a pause in whatever genre we're looking at and think, okay, how does this poetry then apply to this? I think one of the greatest examples of this is probably in Genesis 1. We have the poetic account of creation, and then into Genesis 2 we have a more detailed and more exact representation of creation, what it looks like. But the main point of Genesis 1 is to reveal who God is. It reveals that there is a God, that God is a creator, that he loves his creation, that he has plans because he has to separate everything before he starts to fill it. And all of these different things are supposed to point towards who God is. And that's the big theme that is in Genesis 1. Oh boy. Yeah. That especially makes things very difficult, right? Because if we're looking at the words, and then from the words we have to try to figure out what the theme is rather than the theme being explicitly stated within the words, the themes that are present are so incredibly wide and varied. We can find a poem that has this great theme of loss and regret and lamentations and sorrow, and then right next to it we might find a poem about joy in rejoicing in the Lord through struggles and hardships. And you might think, well, these two tones are so incredibly different, and yet poetry is being used to express both of them. And at its heart, poetry is used to express the feelings of the author. And so when we're looking at poetry, we do need to be very careful when we're thinking about who wrote it and why it was written, because that that comes into a major kind of point of interpreting what the poem is trying to say. But let's go into my little tips and tricks. Tip number one, poetry usually has only one theme per little poem, right? So usually you'll have like a chapter, and that chapter will be a poem, and the poem will have one big theme. Might be lamentation, might be sorrow, might be rejoicing, it might be an expression of sin, but there'll usually only be one theme. And tip number two is that within this theme, there are kind of little sub-themes. So we might, for example, the judgment on Jerusalem might be the theme of the poem, right? And then the way that poems are structured is that they'll use pair of lines. So you might remember kind of rhyme schemes that you might have talked about in English, where it goes like A, B, A, B. These poems do that. They go like A, B, B, C, C, so they have pairs of lines. And the first one will give kind of a statement, like the Lord expresses his wrath against Jerusalem, and then the next one can either agree with that statement, deepen the information that we get, like give us more information about the previous statement, or just contradict that statement. So the Lord has poured wrath into Jerusalem, and it will stand no more. Agrees with the statement. God has poured his wrath onto Jerusalem for their sins and transgressions. Deepens the knowledge of why God has poured his judgment out on them. God has poured out his wrath on Jerusalem, but how do I contradict that? But his faithful love will remain on them. And so when we're thinking about the different sub-themes, that's one of the things that will point us towards the big theme across all of the entire chapter, the entire section of scripture that we're looking at, is to identify these little sub-themes and think, all right, how are these little points being made to point us towards this big idea of why this person is writing? Point number three, try not to get too bogged down into the details. The poetry is far more about expressing the emotions and the feelings and the thoughts of the author. It's not so much about like an essay where every kind of word choice matters and pointing you towards some great conclusion or keep reinforcing this point. But yeah. Oh goodness, I have lost my train of thought. Don't get too bogged down into the details. Rather try and look big picture. What are the sub-themes? What are the big themes? And then how does the author relate to these themes? What do they want us to learn about those themes? Does it really matter that Jerusalem is like a donkey in the wilderness? Not really. Is it a donkey in the wilderness because they have turned to idol worship and abandoned God? That's the important bit. Let's focus in on that. Not Jerusalem is a donkey. That's a bit weird. There's stuff there, but once again, let's go to big picture first. And then off of that, point number 4, poetry is still scripture, which means that God still wants us to read it, and he inspired this genre and style of writing also. And what this means is that God's intention for writing needs to be on display. And God's intention of the entire Bible is to reveal things about him, reveal truths about humanity, and to reveal his interaction with humanity. So God, humanity, and how those two interrelate. Those are the three big things that God is trying to bring out in the Bible, right? That's the big thing that he wants people to know. And poetry succeeds in this just as much as everything else. So when we're thinking about like the Lamentations of Jerusalem, we need to be thinking, all right, what has happened here? What does it teach us? The Lamentations of Jerusalem after its destruction. Well, we need to think, okay, what does it teach us about God? He doesn't like sin. There are consequences and punishments for sin, and he is a just God who has to enact that punishment. What do we learn about people? Well, we are a sinful people who are deserving of punishment. But then the third point, how do those two interact? Well, God is the one who has to punish us, has to say, I'm not going to reward sin, I'm going to punish sin, but I will still love you, and there is still a future for you. Those are kind of three big points to be found in a poem of that kind of theme. Once again, big picture is important, and those three big points of humans, God, and relationship between them. And if we're going to move on to the homework, the best part of this little section, let's have a look at Lamentations chapter 2. It's a little bit long. Yeah, it's a little bit long, but I reckon you guys can do it. Try and employ those kind of 4 points, and so let's see what you can come up with. Come up to me at youth group and let me know what your thoughts are on this particular little section of scripture. But yeah, until then, have a good week, guys, and I'll catch you around.